Meeting rooms will never die. They're the places that bring people together, where the truly unique ideas are born. But does the traditional meeting room satisfy the needs of the future? It's expensive, fixed, and full of materials which are impossible to recycle. We are living out one giant workplace experiment. Leases are getting shorter, spaces are changing faster. So we need furniture that's movable, reconfigurable, and scalable. The meeting room has been one of the few exceptions until now. Meet Verandas, the meeting rooms you never throw away. We have created an engineered room system that is inherently sustainable, incorporates massive design choice, and is built for the future. Its modular design means any room variant can be disassembled and its component parts reused to create an entirely different structure. The durability of the system means this process can be endlessly repeated, eliminating waste. Here, we have a flexible, sustainable framework able to adapt to the evolving needs of the workplace in a circular fashion. Verandas, the meeting room choice if you care about the future. Arrive, thrive, and leave without a trace.
Hello, and thank you all for joining us today for episode 46 of our Insights Live panel discussion series. Our topic today, a universal 5-star, how to design for today's unpredictable workforce. As choice transitions from a luxury to a necessity, the obligation to provide flexibility poses a significant challenge for organizations when crafting environments and policies that are in line with diverse needs of their entire workforce. Some topics that I imagine we'll dive into today include universal design, providing the right spaces for everyone in their individual way of working, considering neurological differences in acoustics, lighting, and wayfinding, user control and autonomy towards their surroundings, and I'm sure we'll get into many more. But very excited and grateful for our panelists who have joined us today. So with that, we'll start with some introductions. Lindsay, do you want to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Lindsay Wilson. I am the president of Corgan, a global architecture and design firm, and my background is all in workplace interiors.
Perfect. Thank you. And Matt.
Hi, everybody. I'm Matt Rebbe. I am the design director at AECOM within our Chicago interiors practice, and I lead the team here along with many of my other teams around the U.S.
Thanks, Matt. And Becky?
Hi, I'm Becky LaPoli. I'm a senior manager in finance at Amazon. I've been in real estate for a little over 20 years in every role you can think of, so really excited to join this conversation today.
Thank you. And Sarah?
Hi, I am Sarah Brown, a director at TP Bennett, an international design firm most known for its work out of London, and excited to be here to share some insights and talk with this great group about this topic.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. And from the Space Store side, Melanie, do you want to do a quick intro?
I am Melanie Arden. I am VP of Strategic Accounts based in Dallas, Texas.
Perfect. And Joe Rogues, VP of Strategic Accounts based in the Bay Area, California, taking our time to learn and collaborate with some of our very key strategic partners. So with that, I'm going to jump right in. And I think as a starting point, I'm just going to pose the question of defining universal design. I know that that is different to everyone. Everyone's got their own interpretation of what that means to them. So we'll start there. And Becky, I will kick it off with you.
All right. Universal design. So to me, it includes the physical and the psychological aspect. It really is bridging culture and strategy together. And how can you identify an affordable, curated experience, I think, universally across the globe?
That's great. The only thing I'd add on there is it's good design is where your design is meeting the needs of the user. So, and Becky just did a great job kind of highlighting what all those needs could be. So to be universal, it has to be addressing the needs of the people in the space.
Matt, Sarah, anything you'd add?
I just think, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
All I'd really add is that one of the things that we've talked about here as a group is making sure that when we talk about these words, they're not just buzzwords. So really diving into some of the stories today and how we can talk holistically and have lots of aspirations. But how do we really drill through organizations? How do we make sure that the experience on the back end, back to Becky's point, is very much space related as well as psychological, and therefore we are looking after everybody from the very beginning of an ideation to the application.
Matt,
I don't have to add to that. They've hit it all. So
any kind of lived examples of how on a past project or working with the client that you've applied the concept of universal design?
I'll jump in.
Good.
So I think there's two things for me, at least in my past experiences, when you try to define this. One is the tangible of what does it mean for that client specifically, right? Is it universal in the fact that I can change it easily? Is it universal in the fact that it applies to a lot of people? What is that metric, right? And defining that sometimes is not easy to do, and what that means to that client's specific request. So that's the first piece, right? Of how we do that, how we go about it, and everybody understands what you're targeting. But I think the second piece is, for me, the ones that become the most meaningful are less about this one little thing. They're really more about the holistic experience that day-to-day users have. I have a client who has a whole team of people that allows them to come to the table with design professionals and really go through design holistically to understand how we can make it better, whether it's visual acuity, is it depth perception, is it spaces that are react better for people who have audible issues. So this notion of universal really tries to figure out what that means to a broader spectrum of people, because day to day we design for a lot of folks that are pretty able-bodied and it's easy to understand. But when you get into the nuance of people who may have cognitive or behavioral sort of attributes to their life, it actually enriches the process and it makes the design a lot better, in the sense that you think about things that you may have never thought about before in painting this wall white or black or brown or whatever the color might be, and what that trigger actually has for people. And then as I go forward, he's like, I could do this more effectively later. So it's almost a re-education process of learning by example to some extent that I find really interesting. And it's something that I would tell you we're seeing a lot more responsibility on the client side post-pandemic than maybe we did pre-pandemic. But again, I think it's also the fact that a lot of people are just a lot more clued into these things, as the general population of the world wants to be more inclusive in how they think about each other.
I'd like to tag on to that and agree that it is definitely coming more into our conversations. What I would like to also add is that to pay respect to this, going through a design process and having conversations is only one piece of the puzzle. Making sure there's really the why, and we talked a bit more about the in our session yesterday about how we can really back this up with validation and science. There's a lot that's out there that is beyond metrics and benchmarking that can really help us, and documenting that for long projects or organizations that have a lot of change over time. That's okay, but we can't just have the conversations. We need to really make sure that as a group, we are putting these milestones down together to make sure it does end up at the end of the process.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think to me, this all feels new. So I'm interested just to kind of how much of this was happening pre-pandemic, and is it all kind of new emphasis? I'm sure there had to have been some amount, but be glad to know thoughts on how much this changed or increased as I don't think we can say we came out of the pandemic, but
I mean, I think the tension now is more focus on utilization of these assets, right?
Mhm.
Real estate is an asset. These real estate workplaces are at the heart of it, a tool to help businesses accomplish what they want to accomplish. I think there is certainly a new focus on how much are they being used, what parts of them are being used, why are people using them or not using them. And a lot of this science that Sarah was just speaking about and research, it was already being gathered. These were
Mhm.
fields that were already being investigated. But as we're all trying to help our clients understand why is this facility everyone's favorite and no one wants to go here, the science can really help us and the research can really help us understand the human experience, the wide variety, and why people may do the things they do. I don't think there was the same focus on utility and usage that we see now.
I'd agree with Lindsay, like really bringing the human element to the table and paying
Mhm.
attention to it. We talked a little bit about introducing feelings in the workplace. That is something that is post-pandemic. And I think while this science and research has been available, it has been happening, it really has been prioritized of understanding the voices coming from the bottoms up and really bridging that with top-down leadership of how do we do this? How do we scale it? How do we make it sustainable for all enough so that we aren't constantly changing spaces because of the speed of how much we change?
Mhm.
Yeah, that speed. I think the speed is what's accelerated, and it's only going to get faster. In terms of physical space, and I would say the choice environments and some of the language that is now heavily used and backed up and getting a lot more attention in the detail perspective. But holistically, I would say, back to Joe, your question, there was a lot that was there before the pandemic, but what the pandemic did was put a mass acceleration on the fact
Yep.
that we had a huge human problem. And it forced things like tech and HR and organizations to really focus and accelerate to ensure that through the pandemic we survived. And now we are very much in how do we thrive. So it's not done yet. We have to, Becky's talked a lot about being in the 2030. We still have to push for that. We have to solve a
Mhm.
lot now, but keep pushing.
yeah, I think it's exciting that the folks around the table and part of the discussions and making these decisions has widened. There's different user groups that are being brought involved. That to me is
Mhm.
exciting. And then the acceleration, of course, is kind of, if we have to take a positive away from the pandemic, I think that is it, something we should celebrate. The fact that it did accelerate a lot of things that were kind of just over in the corner that needed to be solved or thought about that just weren't getting enough attention.
Sorry, I'd like to add one more point to that. We're very much seeing that early in the designs, in the programming phase, we are bringing in key stakeholders earlier. So acknowledging you need to have a D&I accessibility stakeholder in your organization from the beginning, technology representative from the beginning, so that we don't lose that client thread. Because as you said, Joe, we've always said that needs to be talked about. It will get solved in the design process. And what we were finding is either it was coming in too late and there was a real estate reason we couldn't bring it in. I think accessibility is a huge one. It is expensive. Sustainability can be expensive. So if you don't have those representations at the very beginning, they can unravel.
There's a there's a favorite quote of mine from Peter Drucker of culture eats strategy for breakfast. In the end, if you're not listening to that culture and how they
Mhm.
operate physically in that building, again, back to physical and psychological, having both of those, and like you said, Sarah, all of those um, groups at the table from the very beginning, it'll be an unbreakable formula once you start getting into it.
Yeah, I love that. Matt, I think you mentioned this recently in a conversation, just the fact that we're in a time where we may have the widest range of different generations from an age perspective in the workforce at the same time. So that really made me take away and think about just in the mindset of universal design, how you're the youngest generation to the oldest, how you're designing a space that feels comfortable and works for them. And any kind of thoughts or experiences of how you've had to work through those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the tangible, which is you are designing for people who have different expectations across a spectrum, right? I mean, from an experience standpoint, an expectation standpoint, and that expectation is not only how the physical space supports them, but then how the people around them support them. The part that we as the design professional or anyone on this phone or this call doesn't have the control over, right? I can't control what other people do. But the reality is we have to have those conversations up front, is that it's more than just, I can put this table and chair here and it solves all your world problems. It's really much bigger than that. It's much more holistic, and bringing it in a way that makes it feel as though they have part of that conversation. I think a little bit of what we talked about yesterday was oftentimes people of a different generation are the ones making a decision, right? They're helping to lead that process. They're maybe more executive or more senior in an organization, and they've been put in a position to help educate, help solve, fill in all those blanks, right? But the people at the farthest end of the spectrum, what we'll call the brand new early career professional, has a very different expectation of how they may want to interact in space. It's no mystery that when anyone comes out of university today is very different than when someone came out of university in 1982. All of those people are still in the same workplace. I mean, and if not further back, everyone today is basically at the primary level taught that the best way to solve a problem is through collaboration. They sit in groups of 4 or 5. Anybody with small children or even high school knows this is how they operate. But then you transition to the workplace and you're supposed to just magically sit in this box and solve a problem in little bitches in a row, and you're back at a place you're like, it does not compute, right? So there's a huge shift in there, and being able to explain that to people who are making decisions sometimes is a real eye opener. We actually had a client that we took and showed them how universities operate, and it was not a university project, it was a corporate workplace project, but we had to show them, how do you actually, who are these people that we need to be talking about? And these were the people we were talking about when we were talking about attraction or retention, right? And then I had no idea this is how they learn, or how, and they've been taught to collaborate for the better part of 25 years. This is how you do it. Working together, working alone together, working together alone, like all across this spectrum, right? So oftentimes for us, it's about educating other age groups, if you will, within the workplace around what the others are trying to do. And on the far side of that, you're trying to tell people who are much younger in the workplace, like, hey, by the way, they don't like to be bothered. Don't just walk up and engage. Raise your hand or something first. So because there needs to be a discourse back and forth. It's not just one-sided. He's a Gen
I
Xer.
love you on
I'm
that
ready.
field
I
trip.
want it all. So
I love that. We will often, when a client is looking at a longer term lease, 10 or 12 years, just bring everybody back together and say, hey, your future employees are sitting in their 7th grade classroom.
Right. Yeah.
That's always a good reframing. I love the idea of going to the university setting, because it is having a big impact. And I think if we go back to the term universal design, one of my favorite things I see going on right now is just the blending of all these project types. And when we're first doing discovery with our clients, we're talking about their favorite airport lounge and their favorite coffee shop, their hotel that they keep going back to and didn't just go to once. And, digging into why are those places magnetic? Because I think when we talk to CEOs, everyone starts these conversations very similarly today. We want people to use our workplace. We don't have to get into how often and how everybody feels about that on the spectrum of attendance, but whatever the intent is, they want it to be utilized, and what makes a place a magnet. And there's a lot of different things, but most of it is how it makes us feel and how productive were we achieving whatever we were trying to achieve in that place. And I think looking at higher ed and looking at these schools that with one tour can convince a kiddo that that's where they want to be, it's a really good reference point for this discussion.
And I'm so glad personally that we've moved away from something that came right out of the pandemic of making work like home. And that is like the opposite of universal design. My house is made for me and my family, and I love it, but it's not for everybody, and nor should it be.
Exactly right.
And
Totally
so
agree.
I love that we are now talking much bigger, much wider, which does make the conversation more difficult, maybe harder to understand, harder to bring together, but overall more inclusive and impactful.
And I think that's where we talked a little bit about this yesterday, of how communication in this can be overcomplicated at times, and we really need to simplify the language so that people can understand quickly what changes or why we're doing what we're doing. I think with teams, one of my favorite questions to ask them is, how will this space make you smarter? What do we need to do for you to operate smarter? It's not, it might be coffee, but that's not usually the answer. And so really understanding, how can this space actually make you smarter and more excited to work, and have fun in the meantime, instead of having a space be a barrier to your creativity or a project that you need to execute.
Amazing. Also move a little bit away from what is the most productive space. Again, not very universal. So.
That's one of the things that's just, it's so almost impossible to predict, right? What is production? Whoever you ask has a different definition. And you could ask somebody at the financial level, and theirs is all about outputs and inputs and whatever. You ask somebody at the HR level, it's about happiness, it's about satisfaction. So it's impossible to design for that notion of productivity. God, I mean, dare I say it, but because oftentimes it lands in our lap of like, why do you make people be more productive? What can you do? Pay them more? I don't know. I can only do so much. But I jest, but I think it's one of those almost dirty words in the industry that everything has to be so productive. And I wonder if it's an American centric thing, or if it's a global centric thing, right? Like other cultures may value that differently in a way that we could learn from.
And how much is you hear a lot about, we need our employees to come back into the office, like we need to design for them to come back. But quite honestly, I don't know that I've heard a lot of, we want them to come back to be more productive. It just seems like the sentence kind of ends with, we just want them to come back. So how much is that productivity a focus point of, like, we want them
it's a question of what productivity is. So, and coming out of the pandemic, we very much, it was a point in time. I don't want to criticize it, but we do have to acknowledge and grow from it. It was about what is best for me. Everybody went super individualistic, and how can I be the most productive? So that became a hindrance to the collective productivity. So everybody was so much thinking about themselves. And then where organizations are really starting to see the drop and the worry is, how are we going to innovate in the future? How are we going to close the skills gap that occurred in every sector and every business, including our own, during the pandemic? How do we close? It's going to take years, 15, 20 years to address that. So when it says coming back into the office, it's not always thinking about right now. It's starting to think about the individual, the collective, the closing of the gap, so businesses will be viable in 20 years. So it's really, they are tied together, and they ended up being tied together, but the root is really learning, development, happiness. It's all the things that we don't talk about. There's, like Matt said, the word is a little bit evil right now. We got to get into the details.
Are you seeing your clients ask more for help me bring my clients back into the office? Or is it help me plan for their choice to come in the office on whatever scale it is?
I experience both. So it depends on the organization. It depends on what their goals, their vision is. But that's a really good question. And I don't know that there is a solid answer today. Maybe it'll change in the future, but I would definitely tell you it's both of those things.
Matt took the words out of my mouth. It is definitely both, and it changes even during the course of a project or an engagement across multiple sites of what is trying to be accomplished. And I think from our conversations, we all share the same perspective that there's so much value on the front end of the project with the right stakeholders at the table, really figuring out the why of the space, the purpose of the space, the point of view, so that it has a real purpose. I think where we have seen some of the best projects of late have been when there has been that clarity. And there's also been the things that everybody was comfortable that we didn't know. And one thing I love is the change of, we used to talk about flexibility, and it was like, can we rearrange this room to a different setting? And now the conversation is about adaptability, because we went through a period where our spaces had to work completely differently. And some of them were successful and some of them could not meet the task. So how can a space be adaptable? And I'm also excited to see a shift of an understanding that you can no longer set it and forget it for 7-10 years, that there needs to be the planning of capital expense every couple of years, every 3 years, to relook at what's changing, what technology needs to be upgraded, what spaces do people love now. This pop-up culture is real. People want things to adjust and change and see something different and have a different experience. That can be the delight of coming to a place.
Lindsay, that's great. And one of my clients, if we're talking about stories, brought up that exact topic and was saying, our phones, Teams, it all updates before we know it's needed to be updated. So we're always just happy. We don't even know what we need that's about to come. And not that we can do it that fast with real estate, but we do need to be faster. And it's how do we implement that?
I'm not always happy when it updates.
Fair. This is where do you fall on how do you feel about change? Yeah.
I'm applying another one. No.
Melanie, back to what you were saying about getting people back into the office. I think it's also defining the experience. Is it the experience when they badge in, or is it the door-to-door experience? The second they leave their home, they are going to work. What is that experience? Is there transportation nearby? This is more of real estate expansion conversations, like how are we making it easier for people to get to work too, by thinking of, again, that human design. What is your morning routine to get into the office to be productive? Maybe your route right now doesn't give you that oomph that you need to feel productive right when you badge into your office. And while that's outside of real estate design, it is also a data point that needs to be inclusive of how are people coming back to the workplace.
Yeah, that was exactly my next question, is how are you planning for this heightened expectation, this 5-star experience for employees? And everyone has their own expectation, not generationally. Not every expectation is the same. And how are you guys kind of planning for that?
I think first it starts with understanding the culture of the organization. The beauty of right now, and I love it, is the trend is there's no trend.
Yeah.
Because they were all broken and we have nothing. It's going to start coming soon, but the project started delivering at pace again, and there's no POEs on them yet. There's no data, there's no recap. So as soon as that starts coming, we'll see what happens in the future. But really talking to clients about that 5-star experience is ensuring you are your organization first. People decided to work for you for a reason. Holistically address that and bring it to the table uniquely as you.
And in my view, that works best. And the clients that their actions follow their words is when they give their design teams access to employees, to team members, to get that perspective. When we were talking about, Becky, you brought up door to door. We recently had a relocation from our downtown area up to a suburban area. And that came out of, they didn't have a lot of people coming back to the office. They didn't want to, they weren't really pushing it. So they were trying to decide how did they want to use that asset in the future. The input from employees was overwhelming, how much friction there was from the parking garage to the walk, to the 2 elevators, to badging in, to getting the desk assignment, and how long it took. And back to the, what does productivity mean? So many of their employees were like, that's literally like 20 of the most frustrating minutes of my day. I'm irritated by the time I sit down. And when we reported that data back to their leadership team, they were kind of blown away that it was that simple. And so they moved to a building where the parking was close and the entry was easy, and they had more control over that building experience. And that was a really fun discovery, because the answer wasn't that complicated in that particular story.
It's an easy win, right?
Yeah, but we got to make sure we take those, because sometimes we overcomplicate, as Becky say, with our language. Like we're not landing, and just like getting to the point is essential.
But I do think door to door, the neighborhood, it used to be so much analysis of somebody was looking at 5 different buildings or 6 different buildings. I think now we really, with the real estate teams, are talking about what's the neighborhood. That bubble of adjacency has really moved way outside the front door of the building.
We do have a question from the audience, and it is, what is the best approach when designing to ensure that each person is provided for? So similar to what we were just talking about.
I mean, I can jump in first. Once we understand the brief of where the company and the organization is going holistically, diving deeper into that, it really is about the choice offerings and what is provided. No seat is ever going to be equitable. Because we are, as humans, will never be able to allow that. We all want something different. So making sure that it's seamless in the sense that you have set elements, and a lot of times that's around tech, or remove the friction, as Lindsay is saying, and then beyond that, make sure that you have environments that allow people to invest in the way they want to without having to read a manual. We have talked about that, about the adaptability piece. It's overall too complicated, people walk away. So in design, don't over design. We like to do that.
Well, I think there has to be a recognition that when you're designing for the person, you can't design for every single need of every single person, right? There has to be something that's given up by everyone to some extent in order for it to be a great place. And it doesn't mean it has to be a big thing, right? I personally don't like to sit with my back to the window, but I presently sit with my back to the window. But did I really throw a fit about it? No, because I have great daylight no matter what. So there's pluses and negatives. And I think being able to recognize that in the overall design and how it can accommodate people is really important, because then people learn like, oh, hey, they did all these great things for me, and this 1 or 2 things didn't really happen the way I want them, but these 10 other things are phenomenal, and I'm going to take that. Because your experience throughout a day is a big bucket of stuff, and sometimes it's full and sometimes it isn't, and that can be a lot to do with just how your day is, or it can do with how we as designers do things. And to Lindsay's experience example a moment ago, I don't have control over the parking garage or the process by which you badge in, but if I can tell someone who has that, that's a big thing, right? When you find that out. And I think the more we meet with end user groups of different types, whether they're by business or they're by age or they're by some other thing that they or group that they represent, is so much more informative, because it allows us to understand the things that are sort of universal across them all, but also the one-offs and the two-offs that are up and down that make them different and unique, and how can we accommodate that as well.
I think,
Go ahead.
oh, go
You
ahead,
go.
Sarah.
Okay. So back to the human piece of what Matt's saying, you can't solve for everyone, but if you're achieving the 7 out of 10, that's fantastic. So how do we make sure the 3 doesn't get in the way? And we talked a lot about really designing experience first. Detail comes if you have that holistic piece. So then everyone from the receptionist to the security guard to every position now that we interact with, if they are built in that experience host way, then we start to reduce that friction again. So even if you didn't have a great 15 minutes from the parking job, that first person you meet is impactful and softening. Then you badge the next person you meet, impactful and softening. And then, you know, maybe those 3 weren't perfect, but we matched it in another way, thinking about the human. Go ahead, Lindsay. Go ahead.
The only thing I was going to add, I mean, again and again, when we go out to do research about what matters to people, in a way, this always makes me smile, because it hasn't changed since the pandemic, and it is functioning technology and effective help desk.
Yep.
You know, it sometimes I think we get in our own way. And if you just think about the things that are most frustrating to most people and, you know, start the funnel up there. And I agree with Sarah. How do you not let the 3 things get in the way and give people, I mean, we've all talked about human experience. At the end of the day, people want the experience to be pleasant wherever they are. And we know the things that are the most frustrating. And I think dealing with expectations of technology and how user friendly is it and what do you want employees to experience when it comes to their interface with technology cannot be overstated. The cost of it continues to increase. You know, a conference room is not a conference room anymore unless it has screens, cameras, speakers, mics, and delivers a quality experience virtually. So I do think when you talk about universal design, technology and how it's used by everybody, how it appeals to everybody, controllability of lighting and all of those things is incredibly important and not new.
Right. Not new at all. I think that's what I'm excited to see of technology, getting more of that focus of it's not just having an operating phone in the conference room or a screen. Like, how can that technology maybe eventually automate for that user where they walk into that room and that conference starts? They identify, not to get too futuristic, but they identify, okay, this is the user that's in this room. They like this conference meeting style option A, and option A goes into gear, and then they're able to start their meeting right away. I'm really excited to see what technology brings and for it to not be scary. You know, there's sometimes there's new technology and it takes me 5 minutes just to figure out how to start the call because of this awesome new technology, but it wasn't intuitive enough for me or wasn't working for me. I was working for it instead.
I love that. We were laughing about that in a meeting going, okay, we get it. AI can make renderings. That's fun. But just yesterday when my colleagues was like, can AI set this conference room up? Like that is what we need.
I feel like 10 years ago, we would talk about like time lost of setting up like getting your laptop to connect to a screen to start a meeting.
Oh.
I would be happy to see the data now because I don't think it's changed much.
I don't think it's changed.
No, I don't either.
I don't think it's changed.
Room half the time.
No.
So Becky, I love your futuristic perspective because I love the idea of not having to be smart enough to figure it in, just walking into a room and everything coming together for me. That would be a dreamy scenario.
Well, and you'd be surprised how many times in, programming and planning interviews, like, can I just get my phone to run this room? Like, can we just make that happen? I'm all,
You're like,
sure. Okay, I'll take that message back to whoever's making IT decisions, but probably no, you can't. So, but it's probably the number one request is make the technology easier across the board, universally, no matter the business type, it doesn't matter the company, it doesn't matter the project scale. That is the number one request.
yep, technology, and then comes the food.
Yeah.
Oh, coffee's in there for sure.
Yeah, cars.
Yeah. Yes, food and beverage all together. First technology, then food and beverage, then all the other bells and whistles. And again, that didn't change. So I do think all of us that have spent way more hours than we could have ever imagined talking about the impact of the pandemic, it is always a nice reminder to go back to what hasn't changed about what people want in the places that they live and learn and all of those things, and then kind of layer on, but what new perspective have we gained, what did we learn, and what did change. And I think when you put those two things together, you can really imagine the improvements in the future workplace.
To your point, Lizzie, do you feel like there's a lot more emphasis now more than ever on what the employees actually want?
Yes, anytime I go to speak to a school or a group of young designers, I pretty much always start the same way. There has never been a better time to be in this profession. I am so grateful. I can't believe what I have seen in almost 30 years in terms of the types of directions and programming on the very first projects that I remember in my career were, we need to fit 200 people in this space. And I used to call it real estate beige. Everything was some shade of beige, that was in the late 90s. And now every conversation starts with our employees, our story. How do we tell people who we are? How do we connect? And it's an incredible time to be in this profession. And I'm just so grateful to be a part of what's going on right now.
Well, and I think we stated this a moment ago, is that there's not a status quo.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's really down to an organization and their belief and their culture and their vision. And we're here to help them navigate through that, right? Or they already have it and we're doing this, we're there to help implement, help create the vision. But there's no, well, such and such does this and big tech's doing that, so that means we have to do that too. And because even within the sector, they're all doing it differently. It's really much more meaningful to the organization, like I said, any scale for that matter. It could be 4 people, it could be 4 million people. It doesn't matter. It's much more thoughtful, I think, than it has really ever been. And I'm learning that no one's coming at it with malice or forcibility, right? They just generally are trying to make it better. And they know that sometimes it's not going to work and sometimes it is going to work. And the only way you're going to know is to try. And you got to do something. We can't stay circling the drain, if you will. We've got to move forward, and everybody has to be prepared for the outcome. And we do our best to make it positive, for sure.
That's where I think listening, like being a good listener and being able to absorb and translate it into an action, and then experimenting and seeing what happens. But we were talking yesterday about being a good listener. We can listen. We may not be able to implement everything, but noting it down and saying, hey, I hear you. Here's what we're going to do right now. As we experiment, we'll continue to address and see if we can infuse all of these other things that we weren't able to just yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, incredibly important to be heard. I think that's meaningful for everyone. We've got a few questions, but one thing I'll throw in there as a note is I've seen a few polls and have attended a few conferences recently that ask pretty much what's the driver to get you to come back into an office. I imagined if I could have scripted that, technology be number one in all cases, and it wasn't on any of them. It was people. 100% of the time it was people, and that was really nice to see. And I think it's inspiring just to know that is that human experience, those people, individual conversations, et cetera, is really what's most inspiring to get people back in.
I think to tag on to that, and I think it flip-flops, but earning the commute or making it commute worthy. We're not going to get away from commutes. It's not going to happen. But if you understand why you're going in, the people you're going to see, we bring in that universal design holistically, then it's impactful and it's worth it.
Agreed. All right, I'm going to fire off a few questions here. What are some examples you have seen of designing for neurological differences in the workplace?
Well, that's deep. I'll start with one, and then we can bridge. I think, if we start with Becky's concept of you start at the front door, how and where you live and that commute is specific to the individual. But what we can, back to Lindsay's point, is as soon as you hit the real estate, making it seamless and frictionless. And that isn't just through signage or putting a bold color in an arrow. Everything that we start to do from our finishes, our volumes of space, changing the amount of light, texture, biophilic elements that are from the exterior or the interior. It's really those big moves, I think, are where we have to start to simplify and ease space.
I would also add, I think that having spaces that allow levels of flexibility at the individual user level are really important to that, right? When it comes to the way that you behave in a space, or the space can affect your behavior or your interpretation to it, right? Maybe I just need some time away and I need a place to go and do that. And that doesn't mean like it's a phone room, right? It's a space where I can go and adjust color, temperature of lighting. I can adjust sound control. I can be myself in there. I can do whatever I need to do. That just simple move helps a lot of people being able to have that. And, it's not the 100%. It's a much, much smaller number of people. But at the end of the day, it's really impactful in the fact that you've now provided someplace where they can control the environment that they're in a way that helps them in some way.
To take another thing, talking about finishes, if we're looking at accessibility and neurodivergence, looking at LRV ratings and textures on materials, it is incredible. And again, thinking about some of the emerging science around neuroaesthetics and why you put things into spaces. Design can be absolutely beautiful, but at the same time, you could be creating harsh elements that people interact with on a neurological level. So really understanding the materials you're putting next to each other, their reflectance levels, their complements, their textures. Then you get onto lighting, but I'm gonna stick with the finishes for a minute. I think that is something we have to get deeper into as designers, and not just do things because, oh, I really love this wood next to this tile. Why are we doing that? What are we trying to achieve? And beauty will come, but why are we doing it?
I think everybody's touched on it, but acoustics, some of this is back to what we were talking about earlier. Having the research and having the science to support what all of us probably knew was good design already is what's so helpful. Great acoustics start with great planning, and knowing that making sure acoustics are going to be controllable and people have alternate places with different sound levels and energy levels to do their work, we've always known was good design. But now we have the science to understand better how important it is depending on the conditions or what someone just prefers. I think also space, like we all know that a wider corridor feels better. Well, now we also know a lot of people don't like to be hemmed in. They like to see daylight at the end of a hallway. They like to know where they are in space by being able to see outside. So again, it's the science now that really supports what I would call has always been good design.
I like that.
Yeah. one of the other questions, I'm sorry, were you going to say something, Becky? No. One of the other questions in the chat was one that I was actually curious about as well, is how are you incorporating or the virtual employees or with the live, like specifically back to technology in the conference rooms?
I think that's still a tough one. I think my team alone, we've experimented with a lot of different things. But again, if the technology isn't there to meet the way we are wanting to operate with technology, it's kind of going to be difficult. But I think just even communication and having your video on and having that virtual person feel like they are included. Again, it's how do they feel present in that room? There's a lot of times where virtual employees don't need to have as much as we think they do. And then again, talking to them, understanding the culture of someone who's virtual versus someone who may be calling in virtually one-off. They may have a completely different expectation of what they would like to do.
And just to add to that, technology is very important and people are really trying, and not that we've nailed it yet. However, it does require us as people to act differently. You know, so if you were going to have it was different in the pandemic. Everyone was virtual. We didn't have to deal with this. So we got into a way of working. And all of a sudden we need to go back to the office and you talk to the people. You know, it's not just going into the office, it's not just social, but we deemed as that for a minute. And everybody was like, oh, I'm just going to do my in-person thing. And then all of a sudden we're realizing you have to put it together. However, I'm not sure people have changed their habits, the way that they interact, the way they communicate, the way they treat others, the way they might want to be treated if they were virtual versus there. So if we just continue to do things the way we've always done them, I don't think we're going to succeed. We have to bend and ask people how they're doing or present differently. Technology is not going to solve all of it.
We've had some pretty good success of late of really trying to understand what it meant to marry together what I'll call a virtual interaction with an in-person interaction by really understanding what is it that needs to do? What are they facilitating, right? Like, what is the conversation that's happening? Is it like this, where we're sitting and conversing and the space doesn't really need to do anything for me in the background other than be well lit and maybe have some acoustic qualities to it, which this room I'm in is terrible, by the way. But the other side of that is there's productivity, and I'll call it the dirty word, that needs to occur sometimes where, and a prime example was we were doing work for an energy company and they had engineers in one part of the globe, they're in another part of the globe, and they worked remote from each other every day. It was never going to be that they were in person, yet they were in person there, and these folks are in person here, and they need a storyboard, they need a whiteboard, they need to ideate, they need to do all of these things. So that was, once we understood that, we could then design a space that facilitated that in a really well-rounded way. We could test it and understand it, and the technology worked really well. It wasn't just saying, here's a room, go use it. It was understanding what that needed to be. On the flip side of that, I'm working right now today with a corporate client who, you know, the biggest piece of the pushback we're getting is the notion of open collaboration doesn't work anymore because we don't have a meeting that doesn't have this kind of connection. Even if there's 6 of us together at the location, we'll say office, they're still connecting with 1 or 2 others who were never going to be there, right? They were maybe in another country, or they're the client and the client's not flying to meet them. So I can't just walk over to this table and have this meeting anymore. We really need to be in an enclosed space for acoustic privacy, not just for the meeting, but for everybody around them. So it's twisting this notion of what the space types actually need to do, which goes back to my point of you got to boil down to what is the interaction supposed to be and what is the outcome it needs to have so that you can then better design a solution that supports it. And they're not all the same, right? Like I'm a designer. I love open collaboration. I can throw a bunch of stuff on the table. We can look at it and in the sun or not in the sun, and you know what materials do, right? We need that space. I don't need to connect with anyone virtually to do that, but that's a function of my business and how I operate. You have to boil it down to the function of what that business does, right? You know, a lawyer might not never need that, but I do. So I think there's a bigger consideration that needs to come from how we talk about what virtual means to each individual person, but then to the teams they support as well, and then designing those spaces accordingly.
Yeah, well said, Matt. I think I've heard some organizations having kind of best practices, and I think some of those generic, not generic, but kind of basis of if there's 5 people in a room and one person is joining, you know, remotely, making sure you're, you know, checking in with them first. If you're going to do a Q&A, like start with them to make sure that they feel included and brought to the table, as opposed to just assuming that they're going to jump in, because that may or may not be the case. So it's good that people are thinking about it. One thing that jumped out to me as you were kind of sharing some of your kind of learned experience there was people working remote for years. And I wonder if there's been research of like, hey, 10 years ago when you were working remotely from Texas with the team in Chicago, what was that experience like? How did you make it work? What were the pros and the cons, et cetera? Because it's not new. It's more prevalent now, but certainly not new.
Spend your day on WebEx calls, right? Like, you know, or whatever your platform was, but it was just a call.
Yeah, well, what's new is hybrid, and I think that's really what we're talking about. Remote definitely isn't new and has worked very well for certain job functions across any organization. You're going to have some people that are very well suited to it, and they understand that point in their career, and they'll make their choice later, whatever. But the hybrid, I think, is what's really difficult. This and FOMO. So you choose to not be in that day, but the 5 were in, and that was your choice. So you want to be catered for, but at the same time, you still have FOMO. So, you know, balancing out the kind of internal individual saboteurs that are going to happen, and that's back to Becky's point about the psychological part of this. You have to own the decision you've made. And this is why hybrid is so difficult and will be interesting for a very long time, because we're asking a lot of people and our organizations, and we're asking for a lot back. We can do both, but it is going to be tricky.
Yep.
And it will be successful. It's just you have to own your decisions.
I agree with that. Oh, go ahead.
Even if the outcome isn't positive, it's still successful. The fact that you learned something, right? You learned what not to do, and then you moved forward, right? That's a success, to be honest with you. People disagree with me on that, but I firmly believe you're still successful in the journey of learning.
I think Joe, you brought up there's organizations who have had remote and hybrid for years, the consulting companies being at the top of that list, Accenture, Deloitte, Boston Consulting. They've done this kind of in-person and remote and flex for a very long time. What all of those companies put a high value on the time that people are together. You know, even having entire facilities, Deloitte University is here in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, where they bring people together. And I do think that's where some of these organizations are going to have to seriously consider, you know, how are people building those relationships, those ties that we know make people engaged, make them stay where they are, make them want to be part of an organization. The traditional workplace combined with a camera and Teams is not going to create those connections. So I do think that's going to be another evolution as some companies decide, okay, this is how we want to work, but what other, you know, facilities, not to be self-serving for those of us that just build space for a living, what other facilities do we need to support the culture that we want in the future?
Well, we've come down to our last minute, and I'm looking at my notes here, and I don't think we hit half of the things I wanted to talk about. So that's
sorry.
There's always something to talk about.
Yeah. I I mean, Lindsay, you said it, and I think you hit the nail on the head. It's an incredibly exciting time to be in the industry that we are. I think right when the pandemic hit, everyone was saying, oh, you must be so scared. What are you going to do now? How are you going to shift? And even at that time, I was like, no, it's a little rough right now. Let's not sugarcoat it, but it is incredibly exciting, and grateful for conversations like this, and excited to see where we go onward from here. So thank you,
Very,
everyone.
very cool. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Appreciate